Welcome to another episode of Let Go and Lead, where we discuss the new realities of leadership with pioneers, provocateurs, and passionate leadership champions. Today, we're with Greg Larkin, founder and CEO of Punks and Pinstripes, a community he created for rebel executives and entrepreneurs. Greg is the author of a best-selling book with an intriguing title called This Might Get Me Fired. We'll talk about that shortly. He served as director of product innovation at Bloomberg and has collaborated with tech giants like Google, consulting firms like PwC, and ride-hailing disruptors like Uber. Greg will share thoughts on setting the stage for innovation in a company. He emphasizes that innovation isn't solely about advanced technology or new products. It's about understanding organizational psychology, and addressing obstructionism is also crucial for success. Greg will also explain the 5 types of obstructionists and how to make yourself bulletproof when you encounter them. To overcome these obstacles, Greg says executives must ask the right questions, tell hard truths, and anticipate opponents' moves. So get comfortable and get ready to let go and lead. Hi, Greg. Welcome to Let Go and Lead.
Thank you for having me.
Oh, we're so glad to have you. You have such an interesting background. I really look forward to getting into it. And so I'm going to jump right in. I thought it was really interesting to learn that you've launched more than 30 new products in Fortune 500 companies. What kind of products are they?
Oh, all over the map. From products that used AI to detect how geopolitical wars and events would impact the stock market was one product I launched, all the way from I launched a drink for Nestle.
Oh, wow.
So there's almost no industry where I haven't worked and launched a product.
And what do you find as you're trying to launch things, particularly disruptive products? What kind of feedback do you get in the organization?
Well, that depends. Is the product making a ton of money? The But, I mean, actually, there's a paradox to it because over time, what I've realized is when you actually do start putting points on the board and it is growing and it is making money and it is starting to force some real tough questions about should this be part of an existing unit? Should be a spin out? You know, the more money you make, the more resistance you encounter. The more successful you are as a product innovator, the more obstructionism you encounter.
So talk to me about that. What happens?
Well, look, every company at every moment in time has to navigate 3 contradicting forces: FOMO, FULP, and F you pay me. I'll explain what they are. FOMO is fear of missing out. Is a
Right.
company that's using new technology to make themselves a better alternative to us going to steal our customers, FOMO. FULP is what no one likes to talk about, which is fear of losing power. And it's the thing that makes people that have resisted change in the name of self-preservation and self-promotion, they try to destroy innovators. FULP is almost always stronger than FOMO in the enterprise, despite what they say about we are a digitally transformed AI first, innovation first company. It's almost never true. Um, and then F you pay me is every quarter, almost every company has to sit before all the investors that gave it their money. And those investors don't care about new products. Those investors care about putting their kids to college. Those investors care about getting rich. And if you've wasted their money on an innovation science experiment, they're going to kill innovation. And so when you actually are creating something new and innovative that actually works, you're not just creating a FOMO defensible outcome. You're also starting a fight with people whose primary motivation is self-preservation and whose primary motivation is, are investors going to get worried? Are our bankers and lenders going to get worried about what we're using their money to do?
So recognizing that and knowing that that's what you'll face, how do you set yourself up for success?
You have to make yourself bulletproof. You have to be able to recognize the obstructionist defense as soon as you encounter it and know exactly what play to call when you encounter very specific obstructionists.
So As you say this, is there any advice that you can give to those listening in terms of how to read the defense?
Yeah, there are 5 obstructionists: the skeptics, the cops, the traditionalists, the territorialist, and the capitalist. 5. Every time you encounter them, be very specific about who you're up against, why they are resisting you, and then be very specific about what's the right play to call when you encounter each one of them. The skeptic, "I don't think this is a good idea." Then don't pitch ideas, pitch outcomes. The cops, if we do that, we're all gonna get thrown in jail by the regulatory police, the software architecture police, what have you. You have to enlist the cops as co-creators very early on. Help them define the constraints and do not let them out of the room. Make sure they're building it with you, even if it slows you down. The traditionalist, that's not the way we do things around here. You have no trust as an innovator with the person who's a traditionalist. A great company has roots and wings. You have to enlist an executive evangelist to serve as your mediator, someone who has trust with the traditionalist and understands that what you're building is mission critical and indispensable. And they have to broker a peace with you and the traditionalist so that everyone is winning. The territorialist, if you ever speak to my client again, I'm going to kill you. Defer and diversify. Defer. I'm so sorry. It was a terrible mistake for me to reach out to them directly. It will never happen again. I recognize that the reason you hold that relationship so close is because you've done a wonderful job of growing it and nurturing it, and I'm sorry. Diversify. Always have 3 or 4 alternative routes to market. And at the last minute, you go back to the territorialist and you say, "Hey, this thing is taking off. I would hate for your client to be left behind if we go live with these 4 other customers. Saved you a seat. You don't have to say yes, but we saved you a seat." The capitalist. If I ever show your innovative product to our investors, they're going to kill me. And you have to make sure that investor defensibility is a clear, definitive, defensible outcome that you have prioritized from launch. You don't back into it. You make sure at launch that you understand exactly how this is going to contribute to sales growth, how it's going to mitigate risk, how it's going to lower costs. That's the anti-obstructionist playbook in a nutshell. And the more successful you are, the more those fights become inevitable.
And I would imagine you encounter many of them and many different ones within an organization as you go.
You encounter all of them.
Yeah.
Usually, there's a difference between innovation and transformation. When you're creating when you're reversing the decline of a mature business through transformation, you will encounter a lot more obstructionism than when you're building a new business. New businesses tend to not really hit the wall of obstructionism until they actually start making money. If you're a startup beverage company, I got news for you. The Food and Drug Administration is never going to raid your office. Not really. But if you're Nestle and you make a health claim about a new beverage that is not exactly correct, you're going to have some very difficult conversations with regulators. It's going to be very hard for you to get those on shelf.
This kind of reminds me of reading about your story when you were at Innovest, and in 2006, I remember you actually had gone to your CEO to offer your resignation, and I'd love to hear you tell that story.
Oh man, it was pretty scary. Sure. So, yeah. So when I was about 27 or 28, I was asked by this investment research startup called Innovest to uh, basically they were getting tons of questions from their clients. Is the housing boom in 2005 when they hired me? Is the housing boom a bubble? And it was a booming housing market at that time, booming. Anyway, so they had a question which was like, is this a boom? Is this sustainable? How long is it going to last? I was very young. I had no experience analyzing banks. I was very recently out of a master's degree in economics. But what I was able to find was that, and it's the first product I ever really launched in my entire life. I issued a report saying, no, this is not sustainable. While real wages in the bottom two quartiles of income in the United States have been negative for the past 8 years, debt ratios within those same households have increased by 79%. Historically, they've moved in sync. And at a certain point, the people who are taking on all of this debt will not be able to pay it back. And so I took the data that was available to me and made a case that made sense to me. And Matthew Kiernan, my CEO, said, "Yeah, that checks out. I think that's solid." Okay, so not knowing what happens on Wall Street, we published that product, and all of the banks who I named in the report also were clients of Innovest.
Oops.
So it shows up on their radar, and this is in early 2006, and within minutes, the first phone call comes in. It's the House Counsel of Lehman Brothers, the person at the fourth largest investment bank in the world whose job is to sue people. And it goes directly to my desk, and he says, "We are going to sue you, and I just walked down the hall. We're canceling our contract with Innovest." A few minutes after that, UBS said the same thing. A few minutes after that, another big bank that's still in existence. So by the end of the day, there were three banks threatening to name me in a lawsuit, and 60% of Innovest's sales, subscription revenue, had just said, poof, gone, goodbye. That was my first ever product. And I called up Matthew. He was based in Toronto at the time. I was based in New York. I said, "Matthew, I think I have to resign." He said, "What are you talking about?" I said, I just cost you all your customers. I'm going to be named in a lawsuit. You're probably going to get sued. This is a bunch of sharks swimming in water, and I'm just a kid who came out of my master's degree program. This is the dumbest thing I ever said in my whole life. So if you need to fire me and you need to do it very publicly, I completely endorse that decision. That's what I would do.
Yeah.
um, and he said, "Well, were you wrong?" I said, "Holy cow, you're the first person who asked me that all day. People have just been threatening me how they're gonna kill me and tarnish me, but no one's actually said, like, your data's incorrect." No, I don't think I am, actually. I don't all the numbers hold up, and we've been poring over it. And he said, "Well, everyone who called you called me before they called you." And here's what I told them: "If any one of them comes after us, I'm going to take out a full page ad in the Wall Street Journal and another full page ad in the Financial Times, publishing your report and publishing their rebuttal. We are small, but we are not powerless." That's literally the only reason I was the first person to predict the subprime mortgage crisis, because I had a leader who was courageous and a leader who stuck by his principles and um, had some fire in the belly and tenacity. That's the only reason that happened. Every other analyst on Wall Street who saw the same thing was told by their boss to stand down. That's why there was a bubble, because there was a complete lack of courage in finance. It was an industry of cowardice.
That's an incredible story. And what happened then to Innovest?
I thought we were wrong. I was hoping that no one noticed. If you actually read the report, we were very careful in our language. We said there are some headwinds, and we think we have reason to believe, it's very carefully worded. It wasn't saying this is, and we did mention numbers, and we did say it's going to be hundreds of billions of dollars, and we did name names, but we did it with very delicate language because it was really bold and very contrarian at the time. But when Bear Stearns did collapse, and when HSBC had two of its funds collapse, and when Lehman Brothers collapsed, suddenly everyone on Wall Street is looking for anyone who saw this coming and might know what has a hypothesis of what's going to happen next, and they found us. And suddenly I'm the guy that they're calling on to CNBC. I'm 29 at the time, or 30 maybe. I didn't know. And I'm the wonderkind suddenly that's in all the papers. And the night that Lehman Brothers collapsed, National Public Radio had me as the headline guest about who's going to fall next, when are they going to fall. um and Innovest uh had an exit because of that. We had more clients than we knew what to do with. Our sales boomed because we had the ability to be courageous. And we were acquired for $18 million, which at that time was a big exit. Uh, in 2009, in the epicenter of the biggest financial crisis since the Great Depression.
Well, that's an amazing story, and, I love how you framed it as all about courage, because there's so many times when people should speak up and don't.
I think that's the norm. It really is.
Yeah.
In my current company, Punks and Pinstripes, being someone who is comfortable being a punk, meaning if I get fired, I get fired. If I'm an outlier, I'm an outlier. There's actually a very useful place in any institution to be courageous. There are situations that require someone to speak truth to power, even if it costs them personally.
One thing I'm eager to discuss is your book, This Might Get Me Fired, which is, of course, a very provocative title. You talk about it as being a manual for the closeted entrepreneur. Tell us a little bit about that.
So look, I think what happens after a while, if you're born with the wiring of a to push for change and progress and transformation, and that's the thing that gives you all your juice, and you're in an organization where people are incentivized to keep things the same, it's a really painful existence. After Innovest, I wound up having to we had an exit, but that meant that we had to go through this transition of going from entrepreneurs to intrapreneurs. It's one of the hardest things I ever went through in my life because all the fire in the belly, that courage, like what Matthew demonstrated, that'll get you killed. And even if it's necessary, it's going to get you killed. And once I realized that, you look around and there's a bunch of people who face this fork in the road where they had to extinguish their entrepreneurial flame in order to get a promotion, in order to not get fired, in order to navigate the politics, in order to navigate the corporate culture. And they had to kind of keep depriving their entrepreneurial innovation flame of oxygen. They had to keep turning it down, stay out of trouble, keep a low profile, say the right thing, don't upset this faction that's fighting with the other faction. Just why can't you just be safe and stable and be comfortable with the fact that you have health benefits and a 401k and a decent salary? You know, the people who did the best did the most ordinary, mediocre, not pushing the envelope, like, just keep the lights on, don't make anyone think that you're a problem child, don't agitate, um, and it was a tragedy.
What would you recommend to leaders in terms of developing a stronger entrepreneurial and courageous workforce?
Skip levels is very important. When you say you wanna innovate, be very clear about who you want to empower, what innovators don't have a voice inside of your organization that should have a voice. Be very willing to have willing to delete requirements from the system. What does that mean? How you build things inside of an organization isn't necessarily how you innovate. And when you want to delete waste, delete mediocrity, and replace it with something that is better, faster, smarter, cheaper, The way in which you accumulate and hold on to power here is by eliminating waste and replacing it with something that's better, faster, smarter, and with people who are hungrier than we've been used to before. You're going to have some really difficult conversations with people who have been able to hold on to power because they were complacency and they didn't rock the boat for a very long time. And I think what's often communicated to leaders that understand that innovation and transformation is mission critical and essential is great. Here's like an easy bake recipe. Here's 8 easy steps to become more innovative. And it has to do with tactics rather than the complete transformation of the culture and power dynamic that has made the organization get to a place where it was stagnant in the first place. If you can't have that talk, you can't change.
Right.
Most people aren't selling how to have that talk.
It's interesting because we focus on the human struggle of change, and that's where it all comes together, right? Is helping people have those courageous conversations, make those decisions, do it in a loving, kind way, but do it.
Or do it in a way that scares the hell out of you, where you're really ham-fisted about it, and you have to patch it up afterwards, and you have to convey that that's it's nothing personal, it's just we can't afford it. Look, I say that there are 5 crises that make innovation possible, and they're entirely earnings centric, right? There's disruption. A new company, a new entrant using new technology and a new business model starts to steal your customers. There's a financial crisis. You had a horrible quarter. It surprised everybody. It's not just, we're going like the market is weak. It's like, no, we're doing our job badly. M&A, you have a new boss. That your entire leadership team just got replaced. Or activist investors. Private equity firm, an activist investor just made a huge position in your company and wants to get things better and cut all the fat and replace it with lean muscle. And then there's this fifth thing, which is proactive leadership. Someone who has accumulated power and authority says, I don't want to have to face any of those 4 crises on defense. I want to go on offense. It's going to be painful. It's not going to be easy, but it has to happen. If those 5 things haven't occurred, it's very hard for anyone to have a difficult conversation. Why would you?
Right, and you talked too about the whole point of people, like, leaving their companies. You can either leave your company to go to another company or start your own company, right? And can you tell us a little bit about the decisions people need to make as they think about a startup?
I think people in business completely misunderstand the thing that you just talked about, which is the entrepreneur exodus. It's happening in real time right now. If you read the
Right.
jobs report in the US, um, people don't go a few levels deep. They're like, how many jobs were created in the month of March? What's the unemployment rate? If you kind of go a level deeper, what you'll see very quickly is that the great resignation has never stopped. The number of people in leadership in organizations with more than 10,000 employees, that rate of resignation has only been climbing higher since the pandemic, even through the economic turmoil of the previous year. And that's not just tech layoffs. People are quitting and resigning in ways that we've never seen before.
What advice would you give to people who are entrepreneurial in nature and are interviewing at a corporation? What should they ask or what should they look for in their research?
I think there's a few questions you need to know. Who are the people that don't do well here? Who is the person who you most regret hiring? What didn't you like about them? Why do you think that was not a good fit? It's a really important question to ask. You need to know that. Let me put it a different way. There are a few questions there are a few arguments you have to have before you get married. That's true in choosing a spouse, and that is true in choosing a job. And you have to ask yourself some important questions about where do I want to be? Who's my ideal boss? Do I like being told what to do? What are the defining characteristics of the best work I've ever done in my life? Who was I with? Who was my leaders? What was I working on? Um, who are my colleagues? And what was the worst work I ever did in my life? And how do I make sure that never happens again? What were the defining characteristics of the jobs that I came to hate? And that needs to be economic. It needs to be what was I building? What was I responsible and accountable for achieving? And it needs to be cultural, maybe cultural above all else. Who was I doing this with? When things went really badly, how did we get unstuck? Who was I able to did we have enough trust where it wasn't blaming, but it was actually a really bonding, like, crisis where we were all hunkered in the war room together fixing a problem and trusting one another to kinda get a situation to be unstuck. Certainly, I had that at Innovest where we talked about earlier on. There was absolute trust. When Matthew Kiernan says to the most powerful banks in the world, "If you come after him for being right, it's gonna be a stain on your brand. So think very carefully about this." I got news for you. I'm gonna work nights and weekends for Matthew Kiernan after that.
Yeah, right.
He doesn't have to ask me for his loyalty.
Tell me a little bit about Punks and Pinstripes.
Punks and Pinstripes is a community of business punks, executives and entrepreneurs who are, uh, extremely great at what they do and are a little bit different, defiant, deviant, but above all disruptive. Um, I grew up in New York City, and everything that made me undateable in high school was very valuable currency in the punk scene of New York. And in the same way, being a business punk, being that outlier who cares more about impact than status can be a very lonely existence inside of a big company, inside of most industries, inside of most startups. Um, but at a certain point, people, I think, come to recognize that it's an asset, not a deficit.
And what is the community? What makes it a community?
We have 200 members. We will never have more than 200. It's limited. It's extremely curated. And it ranges from the CIO of Bank of New York Mellon to the person who signed The Killers to 300 Records and Atlantic Records. So it's all over the map, and it's a lot of it are people who left huge companies to launch new ventures. But it's a very common psychographic. The demographic is different, but like the first question we ask to everyone who applies is, what does being a business punk mean to you and what makes you think you are one? And there's an expectation that they've come to realize A, they don't fit in, and B, um, the world is lucky to have them. And we provide a ton of resources. We have a few principles that we offer to our members. Number one is experts, not thought leaders. We're offering peer to peer mentorship. Every week, we ask every member, what's a near term deliverable where you need help getting unstuck? What's a 12-month goal that you have where you need mentorship? And where are you trying to get an intro? How can we leverage the network of the network? And that Help a Punk system is invaluable because it means that you're not stuck talking to an executive coach that may or may not have experienced what you are going through. Instead, you're speaking to the CTO of Sorensen Communications about how to launch a product in the face of obstructionism. That's a very like, if you haven't survived that, I'm gonna have to discount your advice about how to get through it.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah, so that ultimately, that's the core of it, right? Are we
Yeah,
enabling the people who
yeah.
are part of the group to get an alternative perspective from survivors? People who have gone through the same stuff as them, who can help them.
It sounds like a great group.
It's great. I love it.
I have one last question. As you know, the name of the podcast is Let Go and Lead. And a question I ask all my guests is, what do you think leaders most need to let go of?
It's a great question. Punk is an act of love, not an act of war. The reason I think that's the best answer to your question is when someone disagrees, when someone is challenging you, the ego can get in the way of hearing what they're saying. And I think leaders need to let go of the ego in order to have difficult conversations all the time. The quality of your week is because you heard things that were hard for you to hear. The quality of your job is making it so that people who have to take courageous acts to be heard are doing that on a constant basis. It's not to say that you don't have to make a decision, and it doesn't mean that it's not saying that you're going to be so consensus driven that you're indifferentiable. But it does mean you have to put yourself in a position where you hear things that are hard to hear and people say things that are hard to say. There's a huge amount of humility that goes into that. That's not humiliation, it's humility. Humility is strength. Humility is power. And when you can create that, then you're ready to be very dangerous and disruptive and very powerful. That's a company of empowerment. That's not a company of power grabbing.
Well, Greg, thank you so much. This has been really a fantastic conversation. I so much appreciate your time.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
I thought Greg's anti-obstructionist playbook was really interesting. To avoid frustration or defeat when encountering someone who may be blocking our goals, Greg created an approach to identify 5 types of obstructionists and how to approach them. They're the skeptics, who doubt new ideas, the cops, who enforce rules and resist change, the traditionalists, who cling to established ways and resist innovation, the territorialists, who guard their turf and hinder collaboration, and the capitalists, who prioritize short-term gains over long-term innovation. He assured us we'll run into at least one of them if we're innovating or transforming an organization, and he offered tips for addressing them. Greg also mentioned the importance of courage. I've always found courage to be critical in leadership, so it wasn't surprising that it came up in our conversation today. It's a reoccurring theme in our podcast. Greg said CEOs must have courage to engage in difficult conversations. I loved his comment that punk is an act of love, not war. So we should always be appreciative of people who push back. And since the title of this podcast is Let Go and Lead, I always ask what leaders should let go of. Greg said leaders should let go of their ego. Instead, they should have humility. That's where they find strength and power. Greg has so much passion for fueling the entrepreneurial spirit. It was interesting to hear his perspectives. Remember to subscribe to Let Go and Lead on your favorite podcast platform and be the first to hear conversations and ideas from other thought-provoking leaders, including Jay Silveria, retired Air Force general and combat-tested fighter pilot, Mark Miller, formerly Chick-fil-A's VP of High Performance Leadership, and Bonnie St. John, former Paralympian skier. And don't forget to check out archive interviews with Marshall Goldsmith, Howard Schultz, Seth Godin, and others. Thanks for joining, and see you on the next episode of Let Go and Lead.